We need to figure out here now, within a matter of days, whether this is doable in the short term. Because if it's not, then I think we're just going to move on from our perspective. That the president feels very strongly about that.
That is part of a remarkable interview that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave at the airport in Paris on his way out this morning, and is just really just sending reverberations around Europe, around the United States, and certainly in Russia. He has been basically saying something that I think is long overdue. I'm a strong agreement with it, because as we continue to see the distance between where the U.S. and Ukraine, where the U.S. and Europe, and then where the U.S. and Russia are, continue to go in the opposite directions. We talked earlier this week that on, I think it was Monday night, Steve Witkoff was on Fox News, and he talked about how negotiations with Russia were actually starting to improve, that they were getting closer and closer, and we were on the verge of possibly coming to an agreement. He said, look, this has to do with the 5 territories, which is Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and of course, Crimea. And he said there would be no NATO, there would be no NATO Article 5, and then some other things too. Those were the crux of it. And he said, we're getting closer, meaning the United States and Russia were getting close to agreement on the fundamentals of what this war would need to happen to bring it to an end, what the core causes were, which Russia talks about a lot, because that's maybe even their most important thing, is not just ending the war, but solving the core issues here, or they don't want to end it. They want to either get through negotiations what they feel like they need for their long-term security, or they'll take it on the battlefield. That is their entry position, and that is their maintained position they've had a long time. The other side doesn't have to like it. We can even hate it on our side. But the only thing that matters in these kinds of realpolitik negotiations on ending wars is who has the capacity to make it good and who doesn't. And if the Russians want this outcome and they have the ability to do it, and the Ukraine side wants a different outcome, but they don't have the ability to compel it, then you see it's not going to work. And it's only going to go on based on who has the power to make it happen. The United States recognizes that the Ukraine side, the European side, and the help that the United States has given does not equal what the Russian side has. And so to continue going down this path that we've been on since February 2022 is only going to end in more destruction for the Ukraine side. That is the conclusion, self-evidently, of the United States. We finally have somebody in the White House that recognizes the ground truth reality, however much they may dislike it, but that's just the power dynamics. And so we're moving down that path. Now, if we're getting closer to the Russian position here so that we both are understanding what needs to happen to bring the war to an end, it's moving in the opposite direction on our own side. Now, the U.S. and European side is kind of static. It's not getting closer, really, but it's also not getting any worse. U.S. and Ukraine, on the other hand, is getting worse. And this continues to expand and to actually get farther apart, which is why I think finally in public, the Secretary of State has said stuff like this.
The president has spent 87 days at the highest level of his government, repeatedly taking efforts to bring this war to an end. We are now reaching a point where we need to decide and determine whether this is even possible or not, which is why we're engaging both sides. As you know, Ambassador Witkoff has had not one, not two, but 3 meetings with Vladimir Putin to determine the Russian perspective on this and understand what it would take for them to end it. We, through General Kellogg, myself, and others, have had repeated engagements with the Ukrainians. So we came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end the war, to try to figure out very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is a war that can be ended. If it can, we're prepared to do whatever we can to facilitate that and make sure that it happens, that it ends in a durable and just way. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done.
Yeah, I think not that probably. I think the president is at that point. And there have been some things that have happened this week, I think, which has kind of moved him over the top of that. But look, we want to look in here at some of the things that he said in that clip right there. First of all, he said, we're talking days before we make a declaration that we're not willing to walk away. And the French magazine or newspaper Le Monde yesterday was reporting that behind the scenes, that the fact that the United States with Witkoff and Rubio and Macron and several other delegations from the UK as well as Germany and Ukraine were all there together. And apparently the U.S. delegation said something close to, there's an ultimatum here. Either you agree to where this, so we can narrow the final gap over here with Russia to actually end the war on terms that this is it. And I keep saying this over and over. It's ugly. There's no putting lipstick on this pig. It's ugly. But it's crucial that people understand. It is vital that people understand. The only reason why we have this option to have a really ugly deal is because of the unwillingness to acknowledge reality for the previous 3+ years. That's the only reason. We could have had a good deal in Istanbul, and 2 months into the war, we could have had maybe an even better deal in November 2022 after Russia had suffered its 2 big losses in Kherson and the Kharkiv areas, and the Ukraine side was really at its pinnacle of power. That was the absolute ideal time. We refused to do it. They said, no, we're buoyed by our success, and now we want to get more. We got greedy and continue to go on down that path. But here's the thing, you never were. The Russia had suffered a battlefield loss, 2 of them, two meaningful losses on the battlefield. But battles do not equal a war. And the power dynamics, even then, were so far out of balance, it was clear that with time, Russia would recover and move forward and do exactly what they've done. So we refused to do that too, when we could have had a deal that, comparison to what's being offered right now, would have been good for the Ukraine side. But we lost that. So then, of course, we didn't take the June 2022 or 24 deal, the June 14 lines I keep talking about. And now here we are, because Trump has come in there and the fiction from the previous administration is now been burned away. And all that's left is the reality on the ground. And we're getting close to making a joint decision with the Russians on what needs to happen to get the killing to stop and have the possibility of start to rebuild things for the future. But if we don't do this, and if we can't narrow the gap with the Ukraine side, then genuinely, it would not make any sense to continue on, which Rubio mentioned here in a second. So this ugly deal is the best thing you're going to get. You didn't take the better deals you had before, but here's the thing. This isn't as bad as it can get. It can get worse. If you refuse this one, it is almost certainly going to be the last opportunity for negotiations. I think it is very clear that the Russian military buildup that they've been having, the increase in their force structure, the amount of ammunition that they have stored up, apparently from all these, a lot of reports we've seen on Telegram, videos that we've seen on Telegram, the Russians have been stockpiling large amounts of ammunition, weapons, armored vehicles, all of those things. They've all been prepared. And if they don't get by negotiation here, they're almost certainly going to say, then we're done. And now then the next step is just completion of the military mission by whatever means, however long that takes out. I doubt there'll be another chance for peace after this. So it is vital that the Ukraine side, the European side come together right now with Trump while he's still willing to engage. And you heard Rubio say multiple times, even already in some of the other clips we're about to show, we're still willing to stay engaged, but only if reality is the basis of understanding of what we're doing here. He also, Rubio went on and he was talked a little bit about the military balance. And here he says that there is no military solution, but I think what he means is there's no Ukraine military solution.
I can tell you this war has no military solution to it. It really doesn't. It's not going to be decided with, neither side has some strategic capability to end this war quickly. And so what we're talking about here is avoiding thousands and thousands of people from dying over the next year. We're trying to avoid that. We saw what happened last weekend with a missile strike in Sunni, where people died on Palm Sunday. We're just going to see more like that on both sides. We're going to see more of that. We're trying to prevent it. But we're not going to continue to fly all over the world and do meeting after meeting after meeting if no progress is being made. So if they're serious about peace, either side or both, we want to help. If it's not going to happen, then we're just going to move on.
Listen, that's a rational position. I know that hardly anybody in Europe likes it. Many people in the United States don't like it. More on that in a minute. But that's the reality. I mean, what sense does it make? If you have the Ukraine side moving further and further away from us. Not just that we're failing to close the gap, but it's moving further away. If that's the case, what sense would it make for the United States to just continue on having these talks for no reason? Because be clear on this, the Trump administration is not even contemplating the possibility of adding any new military support. That's not even on the table. We're not going to continue to throw good money after bad. We're not going to continue to take more ammunition, more armored vehicles, anything else in our inventory, and literally throw it into the garbage, because that's what it would be. If you gave any more equipment now, it won't change the outcome. It'll just deprive you of having that capability. Now, that exists on the European side too, and it frankly puzzles me why so many are willing to say we're going to even further deplete our inventories. We're going to further deplete the amount of weapons that we have. We're going to further deplete however many missiles and missile interceptors and all those kind of things that they have into an empty hole. All it's going to do is cost them, or even just given the euros. It really is irrational to say we're going to continue to take money out of our pockets so that we don't have it to use on our citizens. We don't have it to use on things that are beneficial, that are productive, that create GDP. I mean, any of those, you can do all those kind of things with that same money, but instead they're taking it in an absolute zero-sum loss to put it into Ukraine, because they haven't come to the acknowledgement that it's a losing situation. They remain just blind to those realities here. Trump, by this action here, by this really strong diplomatic shot across the bow on the tarmac in Paris today, is saying you better come to grips with reality, because here's political reality. Here's diplomatic reality. We're ready to walk. And if the United States walks, then all these other positions get a lot shakier. See, what they want is they want the United States to just continue just kicking the can down the road. They want them to just keep talking. It's irrational, but that is what they want. Because if Trump did that, then that would keep things alive and keep the hope alive that maybe if Russia does some big thing, that he would say, okay, hold, that's too far. All right, we're going to start giving some more stuff here. Maybe that's what they're shooting for. I don't know. It is unfounded hope, because Trump has very clearly signaled from all during the campaign, and certainly every day since he's been in office, he's not going to do that. And now he is showing with action that the words that he said on this topic, he deadly seriously means. And when they're talking about there's no military solution, he means there's no military solution coming from us, presumably. He's also very focused on the deaths, because he's like, well, it's not even just about the money to Trump, at least what they're saying publicly. It's not just about all the cash that's going out of the rounds of ammunition, the vehicles, artillery pieces, all those kind of things. He's talking about the amount of people that died. Now, that's what is on my head every single day, is why have all these people died? And you see Gary showing right there that there was another exchange of dead servicemen that each side has done. Sometimes they do prisoner exchanges, but also other times they do these kinds of body exchanges where one troops or another die on their side of the line, and so they repatriate the body so that they can have respectful and honorable burials and give them back to their families, etc. This one here was 900 for the Russian side, and 900 given by the Russian side, Ukraine, and only 41 Russians returned in exchange. That's the same ratio as the last time this was done. It was about a month ago, and there was a similar ratios. There's a reason for that, because there are substantially more Ukraine men dying every day than there are Russians. Now, that's obviously just a fraction of the number. Sometimes there's that many, 900, over 1,000 in a single day is not uncommon on this 2,000 kilometer front. So that by itself isn't surprising. That's just how many apparently have fallen on, the other side of the line, where the Ukraine side couldn't retrieve them, or the Russian side couldn't retrieve their casualties, etc. But that just tells you how many people are dying. And that's one of the things that the United States is saying. It's not even just about the money and the equipment, but why do you want to keep going on something where the people die every day that you're supposed to be defending? The people that are supposed to be on your side of this, they are paying this fatal price every bloody day. And I don't know why it hasn't moved. It just is disturbing to me on many levels, frankly, that the senior members of the so-called elite throughout Europe, definitely in Ukraine, are unmoved by the daily loss of their side. And now it would be one thing if the dynamic, the power dynamic was, instead of like this, it was like this, and that with a little bit more effort, a few more and pieces of ammunition, a few more tanks or something like that, a little bit more time, then maybe things could tip over. Then it's a valid possibility. Maybe we should continue, even with really high casualties. That's not necessarily a bad calculation to make, if there is a rational possibility. It doesn't even have to be a big one. If there is a sizable possibility, maybe a 1 in a 40% chance, a 30% chance, maybe even. I might go as low as 20 if the consequences of a loss were sufficient, but probably not. I wouldn't go below even a 30, because then that means there's a 70% chance that all this sacrifice is for nothing. We're in a place right now where it's literally 99% certainty of failure. And I only put this 1% in because there's always the human issues involved here and some crazy thing that I can't even imagine could happen. But it's a virtual certainty that every man you send into combat today, every man that the European Union supports with ammunition and weapons and diplomatic cover, is a virtual certain to die. I mean, there's no better way to put this. There's no way to sugarcoat that. That's just the truth of it. And we see it playing out every day. Not anything you have to take my word for. You can just look at the body counts and look at the territorial losses that are continue to get chewed up from the Russian side moving to the west. That's just the reality of it here. Now, Rubio also spoke about the diplomatic effort. He had mentioned that we've been, Witkoff had talked to Russia. Well, unlike his predecessor, Secretary of State Rubio talked to his counterpart in Russia.
I spoke to Mr. Lavrov yesterday because when we have these kinds of meetings, it's important for you to communicate to the other side. Otherwise, they don't know what happened. Now they're relying on rumors or whatever's out there. So I spoke to him very directly. I said, we had a meeting today with the Ukrainians. We proposed an outline. We didn't go into specificity about it, but I think he has an understanding of some of the elements of it. I'm sure he does. I said we thought it was constructive. We thought it was positive. Nobody rejected anything. Nobody got up from the table and walked away. They're going to go back to their capital, spend a few days mulling over it, come back to us early next week. And also wanted them to know that the French and the British and the Germans were very constructive and helpful.
So he said in the midst of that, he said that we had talked to the Russian side. They had an understanding of our position. Well, of course they do, because Witkoff earlier this week said after his third meeting with Putin that, yes, we do have a general understanding. It's these 5 territories. It's no NATO. It's no Article 5. It's, denazification, however Russia wants to define that. That's probably one of the areas where there's still some daylight between the U.S. And the Russian side here. But we have the general understanding. So they definitely do. We communicated directly to Putin himself. And we don't know for sure what Putin has said in response to that. But you see that Witkoff said on Monday that he thought we were really close to getting that gap narrowed, at least sufficiently enough to make a deal. So Rubio's right on that. So he's talking to Lavrov. And when he said that nobody got up and left, and so there was progress, and we had the French, the German, and the British on board, people understand it. They may not like it, but he said they understand it, which signals pretty strongly that this threat to walk means that our allies understand on the inside. I had been told by somebody who has some contacts on the Ukraine side that whereas you had the French, British, and Germans who did have at least acquiescence, that is not the case on the Ukraine side. I'm told earlier this morning that the Ukraine side is still saying, no, we're not going to agree to any of that. Anything that gives away our territory where we have to acknowledge it, not even on the table. That's going to be a problem. There is your real challenge here, and why Rubio is saying the United States is ready to walk away. As you're going to see in a minute, it's not just words I got from somebody on the inside, but Zelensky himself is going to say something. But first of all, I want to look and see what the Russian reaction to this has been. Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, was asked about that this morning, about Rubio's comments. And he basically said, we're watching this. Gary, if you can toss that up there. on the screen. Yeah, he said, curious, he said progress is being made, but contacts complicated within the U.S. If we can roll a little bit further down in that, I think we'll see the exact quote that he said. He said, contacts are quite complicated because naturally the topic is not an easy one. So it's not really clear what he meant by that. Russia is committed to resolving this conflict, ensuring its own interest, and is open to dialogue. We continue to do this. That's an important statement there, because what he's saying is we're willing to talk, we're willing to have a dialogue, and really the Russians have been saying this from the outset, but it's going to have to be on our terms that we can live with, because, and I'll repeat this over and over, they have the leverage to do it. They have the ability to say, this is our minimum line here. And if you don't meet our minimum line, we'll just keep fighting until we get it. And that was also underscored by a different Russian last night from the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, who at some point after Rubio had talked to Lavrov, so presumably those two had counseled together before they made this statement, but on the terms of a ceasefire specific and whether we're even close to it, the ambassador had this to say.
Although Zelensky publicly expressed support for the ceasefire, in reality Ukrainian forces have largely disregarded it, launching attacks on Russia's fuel and energy infrastructure on a daily basis. What I don't know, how close are we to the ceasefire, is a big question to me personally, because as I said, we had an attempt on a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure, which was not observed by the Ukrainian side. So in these circumstances, to speak about ceasefire is simply unrealistic at this stage.
Now, this matches what we've been saying from the most. When it was announced in the middle of last month that the United States had gotten acquiescence from the Ukraine side for a complete 30-day ceasefire, and then we went and talked to the Russians, and they said, well, we won't agree to a full ceasefire, but we'll talk about a limited one on energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea, et cetera. Those ended up being talked about a lot, but we said at the time it didn't make any sense that Russia would agree to that. And I don't think they ever had any intention on agreeing to a ceasefire, because that would be in the benefit of the Ukraine side far more than anything than the Russians would benefit from. So I didn't see any chance that they would actually do it. I mean, it would really be costly for the Russian side. And they had said from the beginning that there won't be a ceasefire, there won't be a pause, there won't be a truce. We'll talk about negotiations. They always said we're absolutely willing to talk and have discussions and negotiations and come to a complete and total end of war negotiation. And once that's done, then the guns can go silent. But until that time, they said they would continue on it, and that's exactly what they've done. And so now then I think you see the Russians are to a certain extent smelling blood in the water, and they say they don't even have to have their pretense anymore. So you have the UN ambassador for Russia there just saying, we don't see any prospect of it right now. You can argue back and forth about who violated the ceasefire. There's evidence that both sides really didn't even pretend to follow it. The Ukraine side definitely launched a number of attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. I think there was another round of it last night, the night before, and the Russians continued to attack here. They didn't ever stop any of that either, and depending on how you define it. So bottom line is that neither side actually was interested in a ceasefire. It was a good idea. I mean, I was for the idea. I mean, if you can get anything that's going to make the guns, go silent and the killing stop, is something I supported and wished that it would have worked. But in reality, we knew that there was really not going to be any chance of that. So now then, I want to shift gears a little bit to the reaction to this, because obviously there's been quite a bit of that. And the initial reaction in both the United States and Europe is hardly surprising. In fact, it could have been predicted. I probably could have written the reaction that I expected to have. And so far, we've seen exactly that. And I'm going to give you one example from the United States, one example from Europe, and you're going to see a consistent theme here, which has been predominated really since this war began. For over 3 years now, we've been having these same kind of intellectual problems that have complicated what the Trump administration is trying to get done to get this war to an end. Let's look first at Washington Post David Ignatius, who this morning was commenting on Secretary Rubio's statement.
When I hear the Secretary of State say, well, we may be ready to move on, that tells me that the president is getting bored, that he hasn't made the progress that he wanted. He promised he'd get this done in a day, and then it was a few weeks, and here we are, more than 2 months into his administration. And what he's finding is that his friend, Vladimir Putin, doesn't want to make any concessions, is not, in fact, prepared for the peace process that Donald Trump has teed up. Rather than pressure Putin to move him towards the deal that would bring a satisfactory end to this war that would stick through the rest of the administration, Trump, Rubio, their team seem to be getting ready to walk away from it, leaving it in the hands of the Europeans. And I'm sorry to say that despite enormous efforts by the Europeans, the British, French, to get ready to take up as much of the American burden of supplying weapons, supplying intelligence, they simply don't have the resources.
Okay, couple of interesting confessions, and that's one. I guess one was a little bit different. Part of what he said was a little different than I expected, but the other part that we'll discuss first of all shows that there hasn't been any advancement in the recognition of reality on the battlefield and of the industrial capacity and of the financial power that the dynamics between the two sides is in Russia's favor. No recognition of those things at all, because he said that Trump has discovered that Putin is not prepared to make concessions. And he said they need to put more pressure on Russia. And I just shake my head. And this is the part I could have written, because that's what they have continued to say for a long time. Ever since Trump came in, they say he needs to put more pressure on Putin. And it just defies logic. You have to admit that for the first 3 years of the war prior to Trump being inaugurated, that's all we did. We put economic pressure, we put diplomatic pressure, and obviously a lot of military pressure. We gave them 10,000 vehicles of various types of military vehicles, 500 million rounds of ammunition of various sorts. I don't forget the number, 5-7 million of artillery shells of different calibers, etc. The intelligence, the training, all that stuff. As much pressure as it's almost possible to put on another country through a proxy of another armed forces without physically engaging on the ground with your own armed forces. There's almost nothing else we could have done to put more pressure on Russia, and all of it failed. It didn't put them into a box. It didn't make them back down. It didn't diminish their ability to continue to advance on the battlefield. I mean, remember, again, that $61 billion package passed last year by the Biden administration, which was claimed that that's necessary to, even have a chance to push Russia back. And of course, it didn't even slow them down. It literally didn't slow them down. Now then, the best Europe can muster is about a third of that here. And that's not even all new recommended money. That's a lot of that stuff that's already been promised in the past. So it's just kind of a big number to put on a piece of paper. But in terms of what it actually means on the battlefield, it's a fraction of it. And instead of recognizing that that didn't work, and that if you continue going down this path here, all you're going to do is end up getting more Ukrainians killed, and it won't change the outcome. He still just says with his mouth, without thinking about the reality that I just described, which is, the battlefield is littered with all the evidence. He still says he should do that. Then he says the one thing that I wasn't quite prepared for, and maybe this is an evidence that there is some reality seeping in. He says that despite everything that has happened here, that the United States could not withdraw our support and the European Union pick it up. So the entirety of all of Europe cannot match what the United States did. And as I pointed out, we haven't even offered anything new since May of last year. Anything that's in the pipeline now is the last trickling amounts of what was already approved. No one's even talking about anymore. There's not any more to give that we want to further degrade our own capacity by lowering our inventories of key ammunition categories even more so, and missiles, air defense missiles, and all those kinds of things. So there is nothing else to give. And so whether Trump stays diplomatically engaged or not isn't going to change the fact that there's no more ammunition and weapons coming other than whatever Europe's going to do. So whether Trump's in or out, that dynamic he put that Europe can't get it done is in effect, period, point blank. You're not going to change. So maybe he's starting to come to some kind of a grasp, but at least rhetorically, he's still saying, yeah, this is kind of bad. So maybe all in all, that's not a bad response from the current elite in the United States, because he didn't just say what a horrible thing is. Maybe there's others to have. I haven't seen those, but at least David Ignatius, who's kind of one of the bigger figures in the U.S. foreign policy elite and across the board at the Washington Post there, that was relatively tame. The Europeans on their side also struggle from some of the same problems and also a lack of willingness to understand where we are.
This is where the US is the only one with the leverage vis-a-vis Russia to strike the right terms. It's not about territory only. It's about sovereignty and about independence, about economic future. First thing. Second thing, if there is indeed a peace agreement that is just and that is sustainable for Ukraine, the Europeans and Ukrainians will need some form of US support into the reassurance peacekeeping force, for the lack of better expression, because without the US direct or indirect support to European and Ukrainian forces that will keep that peace, it's likely that the Russians will want to challenge it and will want to undermine it.
There's that old reassurance force again. He's still looking for security guarantees for the Ukrainian side. He's still saying we want to have this, force Russia into some kind of concessions. But as I've just demonstrated here, there's no power to force them into anything. We don't have it diplomatically, economically, militarily. I mean, there's no capacity for the West anywhere to put pressure on to force Russia into anything. And he's still clinging to, we want sovereignty for the Ukraine side. I get it. I understand why you would. It makes perfect sense. But there's no capacity to compel that. As I said, and this is something that Europeans and Americans are going to have to come to grips with in the future, is that we lost the chance. This I hope and I pray that this lesson gets blasted out there for all to see, especially as we go forward. To God willing, we'll learn from the lessons, but first we have to acknowledge them, that we had a chance in the past to have some kind of an outcome like that. Obviously, Istanbul being the best opportunity, or the Minsk agreements actually the best of the best, because that would have precluded any war at all, and Russia or Ukraine would have had full control over everything except for Crimea. And if you want to back up even further into 2014, in May of 2014 to be specific, if we had just let well enough alone and let the diplomatic process or the democratic process play out, and let the elections that the outgoing and then the deposed, as it turned out, leader of Ukraine, if they had allowed the early elections to take place just a few months hence, then they would have even kept hold of Crimea. I mean, so every step that we have taken has put us in this position here of abject failure where you have no options. So from 2014 all the way through today, so you're talking, more than a decade of disastrous policy by unwillingness to acknowledge reality, has now put us in a position where the only viable outcome right now is walking away by the current Trump administration. That's the only thing that can end the bleeding in every capacity, every sense of the word right now. And it looks good because Russia just doesn't have to submit to it. That's just what we need to understand. And every Russian leader has been saying this, and all the capacities we keep showing, and they demonstrated on the battlefield. And that's where we're at. If Trump is good on his word here and they walk away literally within days, according to Rubio, then we're going to find out how much pain the West and Ukraine is willing to take before it finally acknowledges this is not going to work and we're going to have to submit and have a negotiated settlement here. Otherwise, then what you're going to do is you're going to fight it till the end. This phrase that was used so many times in the early part of the war, that the West just wants to support this war to the last Ukrainian, was a pejorative, but it's at risk of being turned into a reality if words like this from the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, play out.
Вважаю, що пан Вітков прийняв для себе стратегію російської сторони. Вважаю, що вона дуже небезпечна, тому що він свідомо або несвідомо, я не знаю, розповсюджує російські наративи. В будь-якому випадку це не допомагає. І я не бачу в нього мандата обговорювати українські території, бо території наші, нашим людям належать, нашому народові, і не тільки нам, а майбутньому України.
So you had Zelensky went on 60 Minutes last Sunday, and he threw both Trump and Vice President Vance under the bus again. And he just trashed them and said, you're just succumbing to Russian narratives and all this kind of stuff. The president and the vice president. after the disaster the previous month in the Oval Office, which everybody knows about right now. Then a couple of days later, he went out and added Witkoff to that and said, well, he's not even qualified to be making these kind of comments. And if that weren't enough, then yesterday, while all these meetings are taking place in Paris, he adds this new one here that we're not going to give away anything. We're not going to sacrifice this to anybody else. This is our land. It's our sovereign right, etc. If he sticks with that, then he is condemning his people until they fight to the last man. And I want to show you just a bit of a report from Deutsche Welle on what that means, what that graphically means right now on the ground in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, kids as young as 10 are getting combat ready. As fighting with Russia drags on, secret military camps across the country are teaching kids the art of war, including how to shoot pistols, rifles, and even machine guns.
Я знаю, я не боюся. Я вже була і пораненою, і витягувала, і все робила.
Ukrainians realize the war may continue for many years, and they want to be prepared. Today's children may just be tomorrow's soldiers. The camps take that idea to heart with a rigorous schedule.
The hardest part is physical exercises at 6 a.m. because you go to bed at 2 a.m. and you sleep 4 hours. You need to run 3 circles, do some push-ups, some exercises, and then all day you won't sleep, won't eat.
But not all Ukrainians think these camps are a good idea. They say kids should be kids, not trained as soldiers for future battles.
Yeah, Gary, that's enough on that. I think that you get the gist there. That is heartbreaking. To me, that's even more heartbreaking than seeing the bodies pile up in these huge military cemeteries that are popping up all over the country and littering the countryside with these flags of the dead. I mean, it's horrible because you're saying that it's not enough that we've lost our actual combat troops. It's not enough that, by the way, there is lots of reports that Ukraine is about to lower the age down to 18 to its mobilization, to its forced mobilization. And they're going to now try to rape another generation of Ukraine men who the Ukraine side will desperately need going forward. Once this war comes to an end, if Trump and Putin and actually the European Union, if they could all come together and say, all right, that's it, enough is enough. Even we have finally lost our appetite for the destruction going on in Ukraine, and we finally recognize belatedly that it can't be won, so we're going to end it. And it stops tomorrow afternoon or even a few days. Let's say Monday, because apparently that's the next time there's going to be some talks. The damage done already is just catastrophic. But now then you see that Ukraine is willing to, and this said, according to that report there from Deutsche Welle, which by the way is very strongly pro-Ukrainian, but they're admitting now that camps all over Ukraine, it said, secret camps are training children, and they interviewed a couple of them there. And you see these are kids, literal kids, 14 years old, 10 years old, out there talking about stuff that are preparing for combat operations. And what do you think that's going to do to their psyche, for crying out loud? I mean, this stuff is going to take generations to unwind as it is. It is egregious that you are willing, as the leader of your country, to allow this kind of thing, maybe even enable it, for all I know, and support it, that we want to train little kids. Don't you understand that this is almost exactly playing out how the end of the Nazis, the German Nazis, did in World War II? The Volkssturm, they called it. They put basically anybody in uniform they could find. Kids, the Hitler Youth, old men, people who were too old to do anything. That was their last stop. And it was already over by that time. But instead of recognizing it and ending the war early, they just continued until Russia rolled into Berlin and literally destroyed everything and killed everyone who came into their path. Do you want to repeat that? Do you want to put Russia in a position to where it says, okay, we tried everything negotiated to end this in anything approximating a good deal for the Ukraine side, but when that is rejected and when they see the leader of the other side saying what he just said yesterday, and when they see that they're training even their kids to continue the war, that signals to the Russian side that negotiations aren't going to work and they can't accomplish anything. Therefore, the only thing left is to continue rolling across Europe, or across Ukraine. Now, I've said many times that I think that the likelihood is that Russia is going to go to the Dnieper River. You keep going further enough down here, and they may say, we are not even going to stop at the gates of Kiev. We may take the whole thing. I mean, we can't rule out that possibility. They have the capacity. Whether they have the political will to just continue rolling is anybody's guess, but they do have the capacity. And the more this goes, when you see that the other side is getting down to kids, putting them in uniform and getting them trained up and ready to fight, I mean, that tells you that they have completely lost, and they've lost any sense of probity to say, we have to recognize we are not going to destroy even the children of our future generations. 18-year-olds is already bad enough, but now you're dipping into even below that. That's unconscionable. And I don't know that any Americans are aware of that. I didn't even see that. Gary found that one himself. So that was news even to me. It doesn't shock me, though. It's disappointing and it hurts, but it doesn't shock me because of this. Zelensky, listen, we need to understand one thing here, and I'm going to kind of leave you with this. For those who are upset at Trump, for those who are upset at Rubio for saying we're going to walk if we don't get the deal that we want here, you need to understand they don't have a viable negotiating partner on the Ukraine side. Europeans can be cajoled, they can be moved into certain directions. We can present them with information that eventually they'll come across. Not Zelensky. He has now taken himself off the board because he cannot be rationally discussed to anything with. He cannot think rationally. He cannot make normal calculations and can be counted on in negotiations, private negotiations, to come to the rational conclusions. He has shown that he is willing to sacrifice everything, his entire country, to continue the war. It's now beyond question that there is no military solution for the Ukraine side. You can't avoid loss. All you can do is end the fighting and end the bloodshed. That's it. That's the only options that you have right now. And so far, Zelensky is choosing the one that will keep fighting until we lose to the end. And with that kind of a partner, there is no negotiating. There's no talking to him because he can't be rational. The only thing left is what makes sense for the United States. And unfortunately, this is the best thing the U.S. could do for the remainder of the Ukrainians who are still alive. Because if we just facilitated the delusion and said, all right, well, I'll keep giving you some amount of ammunition, some amount of weapons, intelligence, targeting, whatever, all you're going to do is make it so that the war continues on all the way and that more people die. If you take away the weapons, Doug McGregor has said this on our channel several times. If you just say, we're not just walking and stop talking, but we're also stopping all of our inventory. So everything else that's been going, all of it stops today. Nothing else goes in the pipeline. All of our people, all of our intelligence support, all of our advisors that we may have on the ground, we're withdrawing all of it. The war could literally be over in 2 weeks, maybe even less than that. Because once the Ukraine army, those guys who are out there slugging it out on this 2,000-kilometer front, once they realize that the game is over and that all U.S. support has stopped, the chance of them continue fighting, I think, is pretty low. I think you'll see something like you did in Afghanistan in August of 2021, where once the U.S. withdrew, the Afghan forces just folded their tents up and went home. That's all there was. That's the best thing we could do, because then the killing will stop. That's a harsh thing to say, but let me one more time reiterate and make sure it's crystal clear. The only reason we're in this position today is because of our collective failure to recognizing truth and reality years ago. This is now what we're faced with. So I really hope that Trump and Rubio and Witkoff and all these folks mean exactly what they say. Nothing would make me happier than on Monday for them to say, we're walking. That's the only thing that's going to work right now, short of a come to Jesus moment for Zelensky, where he says, okay, I'm willing to concede. And then I think the Russians will say, all right, now we'll have a ceasefire and we can talk about the execution of the end terms here. That's about the only thing we have. We'll see what that happens. He said within days. So we'll see if it happens. Elsewhere in that interview, Rubio said that they're going to basically take the weekend through Easter, and then they're going to have some more conversations on Monday. So believe me, Daniel Davis Deep Dive will keep you appraised of all that's going on with there and what happens with that. And any other events we have breaking in between now and Monday, we'll bring them to you. But in any case, we appreciate you being with us today. We wish you all a good Easter and hope it's a safe one for you and your family wherever you are. our hearts will remain and our prayers will remain for the people in Ukraine, for the guys who are fighting this war that shouldn't have even been going on this long. And I pray to God that this Easter time brings sharp relief to the minds of all the people involved so that the killing can stop right after it. That would be the greatest Easter gift anyone could ever ask for. Thank you very much. We appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.